The air was thin in the mountains, and the drive up had been longer than I had expected. I had read somewhere that these cabins were supposed to be secluded, but I never anticipated just how isolated this place would feel. It was early October, and the trees were a mix of bright yellow and red, but the bright colors of fall only made the place feel even more distant. It was a cozy-looking cabin at first glance, sitting quietly in the middle of the woods, surrounded by tall trees that felt like they were watching me. I had come up here alone. I was supposed to meet some friends, but plans fell through. They were busy with work, and I just couldn't bring myself to cancel the trip. I needed some time to clear my head. I had been feeling stressed lately. Too many things at once, too much noise in my life. A weekend getaway was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. The moment I pulled up the gravel driveway, the peacefulness of the place hit me hard. The only sounds were the crunch of my tires on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I parked my car next to the cabin, and it looked so much like the kind of cabin I had always imagined. Wooden, a little rundown but still functional, with a small porch that looked out over the woods. The cabin had no neighbors for miles, not that I could see. There were no other lights on the horizon, and the nearest town was an hour's drive away. Perfect, I thought. I grabbed my bags and started walking up the steps to the porch. The door was old, wooden, and creaked a little when I opened it. The interior smelled like pine and dust, but it was comfortable enough. I spent the first few hours unpacking, setting up my stuff in the living room, and organizing my space. There was a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a couple of armchairs scattered around the room. The cabin had an old-fashioned charm to it, rustic, yet inviting. The wood floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored each room. Everything looked fine, nothing out of place, but there was a quietness to it that made me uneasy. Felt too quiet, like the kind of silence that only exists when no one else is around. By dusk, I decided to make a fire. I wasn't really planning to stay out for long, but I figured I could sit by the warmth of the fire for a bit, maybe have a drink, and relax. It wasn't like I had anything better to do. The fire crackled as I sat back, watching the flames dance. The shadows in the cabin grew long, stretching across the walls. The crackling wood and the occasional wind outside were the only sounds. The whole place felt like it was wrapped in a cocoon of stillness. I hadn't planned on staying out too long, but the fire was so soothing, and the cold outside was getting worse. I had closed the door and drawn the curtains earlier, hoping to keep out the chill. As the night wore on, the storm outside began to pick up. The wind howled through the trees, and I could hear branches scraping against the sides of the cabin. I made my way to the kitchen to grab a snack, but as I opened the fridge, I felt a strange sensation. There was something off. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, like I was being watched. I couldn't pinpoint why. It was a stupid feeling, but it was there, and it didn't go away. I glanced over my shoulder. The house was dark except for the glow of the fire. No movement, nothing. I shrugged it off and grabbed a granola bar. I needed to calm down. Maybe I was just tired. I sat back down on the couch and ate the granola bar, staring into the fire. The wind outside howled louder. Something about that wind, how it seemed to pick up and die down without warning, was starting to annoy me. It didn't seem natural. I told myself it was just the weather, just the storm passing through. But then I heard something, a faint knocking sound, almost like a soft thud against the door. Could have been the wind, but it was too rhythmic to be natural. I got up, walking cautiously to the door. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. I grabbed the handle and pulled the door open, only to find nothing but the empty, dark porch. The wind whipped past me, making the trees creak and groan. I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing to see. I closed the door and bolted it shut. My heart was pounding now, and my hands were cold. I thought I heard a voice in the distance. Someone calling out? No, it was just the wind. I convinced myself that it was nothing. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I tried to get some sleep, but the noise from the storm outside kept me awake. I kept hearing that knocking sound again. It was soft, almost gentle, but rhythmic and insistent. Finally, I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun was shining through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and stretch my legs. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that felt refreshing. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange feeling from last night. I was in the middle of nowhere, alone, and everything had been fine. Nothing was wrong. I kept telling myself that. But then I noticed something. There were footprints in the dirt just outside the porch. They were faint, but they were there, fresh footprints, deep in the dirt, leading from the edge of the forest and stopping right at the cabin. Whoever had been out there, they had been close. Too close. I hadn't heard anything. There was no one here. I stared at the footprints for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were from someone who had been passing by, someone from the nearest town. But that didn't make sense. No one was supposed to be around here. I looked around the property, but there was no one in sight. No signs of anyone nearby. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I went for a short walk through the woods, though I didn't get very far. I didn't want to go too deep into the forest. The whole place had an eerie feel to it now, and I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The footprints, the strange knocking sound, it was all too much. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted. I had tried to call my friends earlier, but there was no signal. It was just me, alone in the cabin. I locked the doors and made a meal, trying to push the weird thoughts out of my head. The night came again, and with it, the wind. It wasn't long before the knocking sound started again, louder this time. It was coming from the back of the cabin, just outside the window. My heart started to race. The wind howled, and the trees creaked in the distance, but that knocking, it was like someone was trying to get in. I didn't know what to do. I stayed still, listening, praying it would stop, but it didn't. It went on for what felt like hours. Finally, in the dead of night, I gathered up the courage to go outside and check. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly stepped onto the porch. The air was freezing, the chill of the mountains biting at my skin. I shone the light around, scanning the area. Everything was still. The porch, the trees, the driveway. I turned around, breathing a little easier. Maybe it had all been in my head. But as I turned back to the door, my flashlight caught something at the edge of the trees. A figure. It was standing there, motionless, just out of the beam's reach. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no way anyone should be out there. The figure moved, slowly. I stumbled backward, heart racing. I was about to turn and run back into the cabin when the figure stepped forward into the light. It was just a man, an old man dressed in ragged clothes. He looked lost. I couldn't tell if he was real or if I was just losing my mind. He spoke, but I didn't hear the words. My pulse raced as I quickly backed into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know who he was, but I was certain he wasn't supposed to be here. I called the sheriff the next morning, but by the time he arrived, the man was gone. No sign of him anywhere. No footprints. No traces. It was like he had vanished. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, locked inside the cabin, watching the shadows grow long and knowing that no matter how far I ran, I'd never really feel safe in that cabin again. But after all of that, the one thing I was sure of was that I was never coming back to this cabin. It wasn't just the figure or the knocks. It was the isolation, the way the mountains seemed to swallow up all the sound, and how in the end, there was nothing that could make me feel at ease. When I left, I took one last look at the cabin. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I got into my car, drove off, and never looked back. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The thought of getting away from everything, work, noise, the constant stream of notifications on my phone, was something I desperately needed. The cabin I had rented was deep in the mountains, secluded from the nearest town, with no neighbors for miles. It seemed like the perfect spot for some quiet time to clear my head. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and rustic. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place where the trees were so thick that the sun barely touched the ground in some spots. The place had a charm to it, like it had been there for decades, though it was only a few years old. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, and the faint smell of pine and earth hung in the air, making everything feel grounded, real. I had arrived late in the afternoon, and as soon as I stepped out of my car, I could feel the cool mountain air. It was refreshing, and a slight chill ran through me. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the cabin, my boots crunching the gravel beneath me. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Inside, the cabin was as simple as I had hoped. There was a stone fireplace that looked like it could heat the entire place, a small kitchen with a gas stove, a table, and a couple of chairs. The bed was unmade, just as I liked it when I first arrived, something about the idea of claiming a place as my own for the time I would be there. The view from the small window beside the bed was breathtaking, the kind of view that made you forget about everything else. The mountains stretched far in the distance, the trees rolling down into a valley that seemed to go on forever. I set my things down and took a moment to breathe in the quiet. There was no traffic, no voices, just the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. This was what I needed. I didn't plan to do much that evening. It was just a night to settle in. I set up a small fire in the fireplace, lit a candle on the table, and opened the windows to let the evening air in. As I cooked some dinner, I thought about how peaceful everything felt. It was the first time in a long while that I didn't feel rushed. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, like I wasn't truly alone. It was something subtle at first, just a sense that the cabin was watching me, almost as if the walls themselves were keeping track of my every movement. But it was easy to brush it off as nothing more than my overactive imagination. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire, reading a book I had brought along. The shadows in the cabin flickered and danced, stretching long across the walls. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the trees. It wasn't a bad wind. It wasn't stormy or howling, but there was something off about it. The way the trees seemed to sway in unnatural ways, like they were bending too much for the wind's force. I tried to focus on the book, but the words kept blurring in front of me. My thoughts drifted, and I found myself staring at the fire, letting the warmth from the flames fill me as I tried to ignore the creeping discomfort. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, barely noticeable at first, almost like a branch brushing against the cabin. But the more I listened, the more distinct it became. It was coming from the side of the cabin, near the back. I stood up, unsure of what to make of it. I went to the window that faced the woods, but I couldn't see anything through the dark. It was the kind of darkness where even the stars seemed too far away. I peered out for a while, watching for any movement, any signs of something, anything, just out of the ordinary. But there was nothing. I shook my head, muttering to myself that I was probably just tired. The day had been long, and the quiet of the cabin was beginning to feel too heavy. I went back to the fire and tried to shake the feeling off. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The tapping continued intermittently, like the branches were still tapping against the cabin's walls. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At one point, I thought I heard something scratching at the windows, but when I checked, there was nothing there. It was getting to the point where every small sound felt amplified, like the entire cabin had come alive around me. I woke up several times during the night, feeling restless and uneasy, but each time I convinced myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I reminded myself that there was nothing out there, nothing to worry about. The wind was simply playing tricks. By morning, I was exhausted, but the sunlight coming through the cabin windows gave me a sense of comfort. I made some coffee, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. The sun had risen high, and I could see more clearly now. The mountains were bathed in a warm light, the trees looking majestic in the soft morning glow. But as I stepped outside to take in the scenery, something caught my eye. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, like something had been walking around it during the night. The soil near the cabin's foundation had been shifted, and some of the leaves were crushed, as if something heavy had passed through. I knelt down to get a closer look, my heart beginning to race. There were tracks, footprints, large and deep, but not animal tracks. They were too wide, too uneven. They looked like boots, but not the kind I'd seen before. The toes were oddly shaped, almost as if they had been forced into the ground. The feeling that I wasn't alone in this place was now undeniable. I had to be imagining things, right? This couldn't be happening. But the tracks were right there in front of me, clear as day. I backed away, my thoughts swirling. I needed to think. I should call someone, tell them about the strange sounds, the strange tracks, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I came here to get away from the noise, from the distractions, and now I was becoming part of the noise I was trying to escape. I decided to spend the day hiking, hoping that some fresh air and exercise would clear my head. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and headed toward the trail I had seen when I arrived. The trail was narrow, winding its way through thick trees, climbing higher and higher into the mountains. As I walked, I tried to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind, focusing on the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt path. Hours passed, and the deeper into the woods I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no one around for miles, and the further I walked, the more it felt like I was walking into another world. It was beautiful, but it was also eerily quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then I heard something else. A faint sound, not from the woods, but from somewhere up ahead on the trail. It was almost like a low hum, like something was vibrating in the air. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was distant, but it was unmistakable. I continued on, the noise growing louder with every step. It was a strange, unsettling sound, like something was just out of sight, hidden from view. I couldn't make out what it was, but it felt wrong, unnatural. As I approached a clearing in the woods, the noise stopped abruptly. I froze, and then I saw it, a figure standing just off the path, hidden partially behind a large tree. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its clothes were tattered, like they had been worn for years. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze, as if it were staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a slow step back, my heart racing. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the shadows of the trees. I blinked, unsure if I had seen it at all, but the fear that gripped me was real. I didn't wait to find out. I turned around and ran. My heart was pounding in my chest as I raced back down the trail, desperate to get back to the cabin. When I finally made it back, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I didn't know what I had seen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. That night, the tapping returned. It was louder this time, coming from all sides of the cabin, as if something or someone was circling it. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the outside from the window. There was nothing, but the unease in my chest was unbearable. The next morning, I left. I didn't care about the money I'd paid for the cabin. I didn't care about anything except getting out of there. As I drove away, the mountain road stretching before me, I looked back in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, isolated and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I left. I never went back to that cabin. And though I still don't know what I encountered that night, I know one thing for sure. Sometimes, the silence of the woods can hide things better left unseen. I had always been the kind of person who loved the outdoors, who thrived in the quiet isolation of nature. So when my friend Matt invited me to spend a weekend at a secluded cabin in the mountains, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Matt had been planning this trip for months, and the cabin was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Tucked away in a dense forest, far from any civilization, it was meant to be a peaceful retreat from the daily grind. We had heard rumors about the area, of course. People always talked about weird occurrences in places like that, strange sounds at night, animals acting out of the ordinary, and sometimes even people disappearing. But I'd never been one to buy into those stories. It all sounded like typical campfire tales to me. Matt wasn't too concerned either. He'd been up there before and assured me it was the perfect spot to get away from everything. The drive to the cabin was long. It took us almost 6 hours to get from the city to the remote part of the woods where Matt had rented the cabin. As we neared our destination, the road turned to dirt, and the trees became denser, casting long, ominous shadows. Matt kept the music off, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, probably thinking about the weekend ahead. I couldn't blame him. The idea of a few days with no phones, no work, and no distractions was a welcome relief. When we arrived, the cabin looked exactly like I had imagined: rustic, weathered wood, a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and a chimney that puffed smoke into the crisp air. It was quaint, peaceful, and felt like it belonged in a movie. I couldn't wait to get inside, drop my bags, and unwind. We unloaded the car and went inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a large stone fireplace, a couple of mismatched sofas, and a wooden dining table in the corner. There were windows on every wall, providing a view of the surrounding forest. It was a beautiful setting, even though the clouds were gathering, and a chill hung in the air. "Do you want to go for a hike before it gets dark?" Matt asked, already changing into his hiking boots. "Sure, why not?" I replied, eager to explore the woods. The trail started right behind the cabin, winding through thick trees and steep terrain. The sounds of the forest surrounded us: birds chirping, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying eeriness about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt different than other forests I'd been in. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. We hiked for about an hour before we came to a clearing. The sky was growing darker, and the wind had picked up, causing the trees to sway. It wasn't cold yet, but the dampness in the air was starting to get to me. Matt stopped to catch his breath, and I looked around. That's when I noticed something strange in the distance, something I couldn't quite make out. It was a silhouette standing between two trees. It looked like a figure, but it was too far to tell for sure. I squinted, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me, especially with the dimming light and the wind making everything look blurry. "Let's head back," I suggested, feeling uneasy for no reason at all. Matt agreed, and we turned back toward the cabin. The hike back seemed longer somehow, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could hear footsteps behind us, but when I turned around, no one was there. I dismissed it as my mind playing games. As we reached the cabin, the wind had picked up even more, and the first raindrops started to fall. We hurried inside, and I immediately felt a sense of relief as I closed the door behind me. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. We spent the evening cooking, playing cards, and talking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The sounds outside were louder now, the wind howling, branches scraping against the windows. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the unease lingered. Later that night, after we had gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I lay there, listening, hoping I was just imagining it, but the footsteps were clear and deliberate, like someone was walking around the cabin. I didn't say anything to Matt. He was a heavy sleeper, and I didn't want to wake him unless I was sure something was wrong. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the wind, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart. The next day, Matt and I decided to spend the morning inside, avoiding the rain. I tried to act normal, but the feeling of being watched was still there. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone, or something, standing in the distance, but there was never anything. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and we decided to head out for another hike, hoping to clear our minds. The trail was a little slippery now, but we pushed on, the ground soft beneath our boots. We walked for hours, getting deeper into the woods, until we reached an old, abandoned cabin. It was falling apart, its roof caved in, the windows shattered. "That's creepy," Matt remarked, peering through the broken window. "I don't like the look of this place," I replied, suddenly feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. We decided not to go inside, but as we turned to leave, I saw something strange. A trail of fresh footprints in the mud leading toward the old cabin. They were too big to be either of ours. "Do you think someone else is out here?" Matt asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," "But I don't like it," I said, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. We hurried back to the cabin, but as we approached, we noticed something even stranger. The door was slightly ajar. We were sure we had locked it before we left. Matt hesitated, then slowly pushed the door open. The cabin was exactly how we had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped inside. Something felt wrong, like we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, seemed louder than usual. I kept hearing footsteps outside, and the fear that had been building in me all day finally broke through. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. We were truly alone, in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, Matt and I decided to leave early. We packed up quickly, eager to get away from whatever was lurking in the woods. As we drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us as we drove away. We never spoke about what had happened at the cabin, but the memory stayed with me. There were no answers, no closure, just the unsettling feeling that something had been watching us, waiting for us to leave. And in the back of my mind, I still wondered about the footprints, the strange figure in the woods, and the feeling of being followed. It's been months since that trip, and I still haven't been back to the cabin. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm sure of one thing: I won't be making that mistake again. It was a late autumn afternoon when I pulled up to the cabin in the woods, feeling the kind of excitement that only a solo trip to a remote location can give you. I had rented this cabin online, a little place nestled in the Vermont wilderness, about 2 hours away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Just me, the trees, and a whole weekend to disconnect from the grind of daily life. The cabin was small, rustic, and looked like something straight out of a postcard, surrounded by tall pine trees and tucked away off a barely visible dirt road. The kind of place where you could imagine the world standing still, where the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. I parked my truck, grabbed my bag, and made my way up the creaky porch steps. The air had that crisp, chilly bite to it that reminded me of the coming winter. I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the door open. When it finally creaked open, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was exactly what I needed: quiet, remote, simple. Inside, there was an old wood-burning stove in the corner, a small kitchen with mismatched cabinets, and a couple of worn-out couches. The place smelled of pine wood and a hint of damp earth, like it hadn't been used in a while, which was perfect. The kind of smell you only get from cabins left to the mercy of the elements. I couldn't wait to light the stove and curl up with a book by the fire. As I unpacked, the evening sun began to dip behind the trees, and the once vibrant forest started to take on a darker tone. I could hear the wind picking up outside, sending waves of dry leaves rustling across the ground. The kind of sound that made everything feel more isolated, more quiet. I started the fire in the stove, the crackling of the wood a comforting sound as I settled in on the couch. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the snap of burning wood. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness outside thickening as the shadows grew longer. But I didn't mind. I liked it. The peace, the solitude. I had a few beers, cooked up some stew in the small pot on the stove, and then spent the evening reading, letting the fire warm the cabin against the growing cold. There was something about being in a place so remote that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Everything felt real, grounded, like I was reconnecting with something primal. Around 10 p.m., I began to feel the weight of the day's drive settling in, and I figured it was time to turn in. I doused the fire, left the glow of the embers to gently light the room, and climbed into the bed in the small, simple bedroom. The bed creaked under my weight, but it felt cozy enough. I pulled the heavy quilt up around me, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, the shadows of the night dancing across them. But sleep didn't come easy. The wind outside started howling, rattling the windows. It was nothing unusual, just a storm, probably. But the wind, that constant noise, started to feel different. There was something unsettling about it. Something rhythmic, almost deliberate. It made me uneasy, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I shook it off, thinking it was just nerves from being alone in the woods, and tried to relax. But the noise grew louder. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It sounded like thumping, like something heavy was hitting the cabin, but there was no reason for it. The walls didn't shake, but the sound was unmistakable. I held my breath, listening, but when I didn't hear it again, I tried to convince myself it was just a tree branch, or maybe the old wood settling. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, my eyes scanning the room, listening for anything that might confirm or deny my suspicions. But nothing came. No more thumps, no more strange sounds. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke up the next morning to the bright light of the sun streaming through the windows. The storm had passed, and the air outside had that crisp, fresh feel to it. Birds were chirping, the leaves were rustling, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Just a strange night, I thought. Nothing to worry about. After breakfast, I decided to go for a hike. The woods around the cabin were dense with trees, and the thought of spending the day outdoors seemed like the perfect way to reset. I grabbed my pack, threw on my boots, and headed out into the forest. The path was a little overgrown, but it wasn't hard to follow. I walked for hours, lost in the beauty of it all. The towering trees, the soft earth beneath my feet, the smell of pine and wet leaves. It felt like I was the only person on earth. Around midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. I sat down on a rock, pulled out my water, and took in the surroundings. The sun was shining through the branches, casting dappled light across the ground. It was peaceful. But then, I noticed something strange. Just off to the side, near the edge of the clearing, there was a pile of rocks, unnatural, like they had been stacked deliberately. I stood up to get a closer look. The rocks weren't very big, just enough to make a small, odd-looking mound. Something about it made me feel uneasy, but I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just a random rock pile, maybe left by someone else who had been there before. I continued my walk after a few minutes, but the strange feeling lingered in the back of my mind. When I returned to the cabin later that afternoon, the quiet had taken on a new edge. It felt heavier somehow, like the air itself had thickened. As the night fell, I tried to shake off the unease I was feeling. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees and making the cabin creak. But this time, there was no denying it. The thumping noise had returned. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, heavy thuds, spaced out and distant. I stood by the window, looking out into the dark forest, trying to figure out where it was coming from. But there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house seemed to be closing in on me, the walls too tight, the air too thick. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the locks on all the doors, and made sure the windows were secure. But it wasn't just the cabin that was unsettling me. It was the woods, the way they seemed to close in around the cabin, the way they whispered in the wind, as if they were hiding something. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the thumps, closer now, and it was all I could do not to open the door and run out into the dark woods to confront whatever it was. But the cabin was too quiet, too still. The fire had died down, leaving only faint embers to cast shadows on the walls. I kept my flashlight beside me, its beam cutting through the dark, reassuring me in a way. And then, at some point, the noise stopped. Completely. For hours, there was nothing but silence. It was eerie, almost suffocating. I tried to force myself to relax, but it felt like the world was holding its breath. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, tossed everything into my bag, and decided to leave. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was making those sounds. My nerves were shot. As I stepped outside, the woods seemed darker than before, the shadows stretching long and deep. I made my way back to my truck, heart pounding in my chest. But as I looked back at the cabin, something caught my eye. The same pile of rocks from earlier, the one I had dismissed as insignificant, was now much larger. The rocks were stacked higher, arranged in a pattern I hadn't seen before. I didn't need to look any longer. I hopped into my truck and drove away, leaving the cabin and the woods behind. I didn't know what had been going on there, but I didn't care to find out. Whatever was in those woods wasn't something I was willing to face alone. I don't know what happened at that cabin, and part of me doesn't want to know. Maybe it was just the wind, or the isolation, or maybe I was just letting my imagination run wild. But I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. It was late in the fall when I decided to take some time off from everything. Work, responsibilities, all the usual noise. I had been feeling stressed for weeks, and I just needed to get away. Somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated. That's when I came across a small cabin on a remote stretch of land near the woods. The photos online looked serene. A rustic wooden cabin surrounded by trees, a small creek running nearby, and a view that seemed to go on forever. It was everything I needed: peace, solitude, and a break from the hustle and bustle of life. I booked the cabin for a week, paid up front, and started packing. My goal was simple: leave my phone off, spend time in nature, and focus on myself for a while. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where I was going, just told a few friends that I was taking a break. The drive to the cabin was long. The road started to narrow as I got deeper into the mountains. It wasn't exactly a well-paved highway, and the last stretch was nothing more than a gravel path winding through thick forest. There was no one around, just trees and the occasional squirrel darting across the road. As I drove, I kept thinking to myself how perfect this would be. Away from the distractions of city life, no one to bother me, and nothing but the sound of birds and the wind. When I finally reached the cabin, I was a little surprised at how isolated it felt. It was surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest neighbor, if you could even call them that, was miles away. The cabin itself was small but well kept, with a stone chimney and a few window boxes full of colorful flowers that had clearly been planted with care. The front porch had a few old rocking chairs, and there was an old wooden sign nailed to a tree nearby that simply read, "Welcome to Fernwood Cabin." The owner of the cabin had left a note in the entryway, along with a few simple instructions. It all seemed straightforward: turn on the generator for power, use the woodpile for the stove, and enjoy my stay. The cabin had running water, though I was told it came from a well, and I would need to pump it by hand if I ran out. I was eager to get settled, so I unpacked my things quickly, lit a fire in the stove, and took a deep breath. The scent of burning wood filled the cabin, and the soft crackle of the flames was comforting. I was alone, peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to think about anything else. The first few days were perfect. I spent my time hiking through the forest, collecting firewood, and simply enjoying the quiet. The weather had been unpredictable, with occasional rainstorms rolling through, but the cabin had been warm and dry. I found a few old trails near the cabin, leading deeper into the woods, and one morning, I decided to venture farther than I had before. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me, blocking out much of the sky. The only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. I found an old, overgrown trail which I followed for a while. It seemed to lead nowhere, but I was curious. It was as though the forest was hiding something, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. After a couple of hours, I turned back, feeling slightly uneasy. I couldn't quite explain why. The quiet had started to feel oppressive. As I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing something, a snap of a twig here, the rustling of leaves there, but every time I stopped and looked, there was nothing, just trees, nothing out of the ordinary. The evening came, and I settled in for a quiet night in front of the fire. As I ate a simple dinner, I kept glancing toward the windows. It was dark outside, and I could see only the reflection of the flames dancing across the glass. But there was something else. In the reflection, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting past, too quick for me to catch. and yet it felt real. I tried to convince myself it was just the flickering firelight, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I didn't sleep well that night. My mind kept racing. Every little creak of the wood, every snap of a branch outside, seemed to amplify in the silence of the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I checked, the place was empty. There was nothing. Still, I couldn't relax. The next day, I tried to shake off the anxiety and decided to go for another hike, thinking that some fresh air would clear my head. I walked further along the trail I had discovered, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that someone or something was nearby. It wasn't just the sound of the forest anymore. There was a presence. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. I couldn't explain it. I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a small pond. The water was still, the surface reflecting the sky perfectly. It was peaceful. I sat down by the water's edge, trying to ground myself. That's when I noticed something strange. At the edge of the clearing, near a thicket of brush, there was a pile of rocks, arranged in a peculiar way. Not just a random pile, but deliberately stacked. It wasn't something natural. The more I looked at it, the more I felt uneasy. It was too perfect, too intentional, almost as if someone had left it there for a reason. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked over to the rocks. As I got closer, I noticed something odd beneath the pile. Pieces of old, weathered fabric. It looked like remnants of clothing, but it was too deteriorated to make out any details. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about it felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be. I backed away slowly, trying not to panic. It was probably nothing, just some old debris left by previous hikers or hunters. But deep down, I knew that I didn't want to stay there any longer. I quickly turned around and made my way back to the cabin, not daring to look over my shoulder. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, more out of instinct than anything else. I couldn't explain it, but I had the feeling that someone was out there, watching. Every little noise made me jump. Every gust of wind that rattled the trees felt like an intrusion. I barely slept. The next morning, I was exhausted, but I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly and was ready to go. The forest was still and quiet when I stepped outside, but the air felt charged, like a storm was coming. I drove away without looking back, determined not to think about the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. As I left the gravel road behind and merged back onto the main highway, the tension in my chest finally began to loosen. I drove for hours, the landscape changing as I left the forest behind. It wasn't until I got back to civilization, back to the noise and chaos of the city, that I felt like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I still don't know what exactly happened out there. Whether it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or whether there was something truly strange about that place, I'll never know. But I do know one thing. Sometimes, when you step into the woods, you're not just alone with nature. There are things out there that we don't understand. And sometimes, it's better to walk away and never look back. I had been working nonstop for weeks, barely catching any breaks. So, when I finally got the opportunity to take some time off, I jumped at the chance. I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. I was 28, living in a small town in upstate New York, and I had never done anything like this before. Being alone in nature in a place far away from civilization. It sounded perfect for clearing my mind. The cabin was located in the Adirondacks, miles away from any town, surrounded by dense forest. When I arrived, I was immediately struck by how peaceful it was. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost overwhelming after the constant noise of the city. The owner had left the key under a rock near the front door, so I let myself in. The cabin was small, a simple one-bedroom with a stone fireplace and wooden beams lining the ceiling. The walls were adorned with rustic decorations, giving it an authentic, homely feel. I set my bag down and took in the surroundings, looking out the large windows that overlooked a small lake in the distance. The place was exactly as advertised, isolated and cozy. There was even a small dock extending into the lake, perfect for sitting and watching the water. I could already tell this was going to be the perfect escape. The first few hours went by quietly. I spent some time exploring the cabin and walking around the property. The land surrounding the cabin was vast, covered in dense trees with narrow, winding trails leading deeper into the woods. The weather was perfect, a cool breeze and the sun shining through the canopy of leaves above. I took my time walking around, feeling the stress of my everyday life slowly melt away. As night began to fall, I made a small fire in the fireplace and sat down with a book. The wind outside picked up a bit, rustling the leaves and making the cabin creak. There was something comforting about the sound of the wind and the crackling fire, but it also added a sense of unease. I tried to shake it off as I read, but my eyes kept wandering to the window. It was almost as if something in the darkness was watching me. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I blew out the candles and settled into bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I quickly found myself drifting off. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise, a faint thud from outside. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear over the wind and the crackling of the fire. The sound was soft, almost like something heavy had dropped onto the ground. I listened for a moment, but everything was still. I chalked it up to the wind or an animal and went back to bed. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the window. The noise from the night before seemed like a distant memory. I got dressed and made some coffee, stepping outside onto the porch to enjoy the morning. The world felt so calm and untouched, like I was the only person left in existence. After breakfast, I decided to explore the trails around the cabin more thoroughly. I grabbed my water bottle and headed out, following a trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches interwoven to form a natural canopy. I walked for what felt like hours, enjoying the solitude and quiet. Every now and then, I would hear an animal in the distance or a rustling in the underbrush, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. As I walked further, I noticed something strange. A small clearing that wasn't on the map the owner had given me. It wasn't large, but it was big enough to feel isolated. In the center of the clearing was an old, weather-beaten shack. The wood was rotting, and the door was hanging off its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I felt a sudden unease creep over me. The shack didn't look like it belonged here. It looked abandoned, out of place, like it had been forgotten by time. Despite my growing sense of discomfort, curiosity got the better of me. I approached the shack slowly, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Creaked loudly, making me flinch. Inside, it was dark, and the air smelled musty. The floor was covered in dust and old debris. I stepped inside, trying to peer into the shadows, but all I could see were broken pieces of wood, old bottles, and other random junk scattered about. Something about the place felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure if it was the isolation or the way the air seemed thicker inside, but I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I quickly turned to leave, but as I did, I caught sight of something strange on the far wall. Scratches, deep and jagged, running across the wood. My heart skipped a beat. It didn't look like something that happened by accident. It looked deliberate. I rushed out of the shack, my breath quickening. The feeling of unease only grew stronger as I walked back toward the cabin. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, like something was following me. But when I looked over my shoulder, all I saw were trees. The whole experience left me shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something I shouldn't have. Back at the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to calm myself. I couldn't stop thinking about the shack and the scratches on the wall. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I had a nagging feeling that I wasn't the first person to have been in that shack. As the sun began to set, I decided to light the fire again and settle in for the night. The wind had picked up once more, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. I kept the lights low, trying to drown out the noise outside. But then, just as I was getting comfortable, I heard it again. The thud. It was louder this time, closer, and it made my blood run cold. I grabbed the flashlight and hurried outside, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. I swept it across the area, but there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But then, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart raced as I looked around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. I turned and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I sat down on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. There was no way I was imagining this. Someone or something was out there. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore. Hours passed, and I stayed in the cabin, too terrified to go back outside. The footsteps never returned, but the feeling of being watched never left. I kept hearing the creaks of the cabin, the wind pushing against the walls, but every time I tried to sleep, I would hear that faint thud, followed by the footsteps. It was like someone was circling the cabin, waiting for the right moment to come closer. I eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, but it was a restless sleep, filled with nightmares of the shack, of the footsteps, of the strange, jagged scratches on the wall. When I woke up, it was still dark, and the cabin was eerily quiet. I didn't hear anything from outside. Slowly, I got up and peeked out of the window. What I saw made my heart stop. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline clearly against the dark forest. The figure was tall and it wasn't moving. I stared at it, my chest tight with fear, unsure if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the woods, vanishing without a trace. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed my things, packed up, and left the cabin as quickly as I could. I didn't care about the money I'd spent or the days I'd planned to stay. I just needed to get out. When I arrived back in town, I went straight to the local diner and sat down, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The waitress, a kind older woman, noticed my state and asked if everything was okay. I told her about the cabin, about the shack, about the figure I saw. She looked at me with wide eyes and told me that the cabin I had rented had a history. Apparently, years ago, it had been owned by a hermit who had disappeared under strange circumstances. No one had ever found out what happened to him, but some people in town said he had been not quite right. After hearing that, I didn't need any more convincing. I was just glad to be back among people. Whatever had been in those woods, whatever I had disturbed in that old shack, I never wanted to find out. I remember it like it was yesterday, although it was a few years ago now. I had just turned 32 and was feeling a bit overwhelmed by life. The constant grind of work, the noise of the city, the people around me, it was all starting to wear me down. My friends suggested I take a break, get away from everything, and recharge. So, I decided to rent a small cabin in the mountains for a weekend. The place was located in a remote area, somewhere in the woods of northern Vermont. It was meant to be quiet, peaceful, and away from the chaos of the world. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive was long, and the last few miles were down a narrow, winding dirt road. There was no one else around, just trees on either side of me, tall and dense. It felt like I had left the world behind. The cabin itself looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine when you think of a secluded getaway. Small, rustic, with a porch that overlooked a steep drop into a thick forest. The sun was setting when I pulled up, and the air had that cool, crisp feeling of early autumn. I grabbed my bag, stepped out of the car, and looked around. The forest around me was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The cabin wasn't exactly luxurious, but it had everything I needed. A wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, a comfortable bed, and a big window that let in a lot of natural light. I unpacked my things, settled in, and went outside to take in the view. The forest stretched out before me, and the sky above was streaked with the colors of the setting sun. I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and some vegetables. As I sat by the stove, I began to relax. I hadn't realized how much tension I had been carrying. There was something about the solitude that made everything feel a little clearer. After dinner, I decided to go for a short walk around the property. It wasn't far, just a little trail that looped around the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and set out, the beam of light cutting through the darkening woods. The path was uneven and overgrown in some places, but it wasn't hard to follow. As I walked, I thought about the last few months of my life. The stress, the pressure, the constant need to keep up. This cabin felt like the perfect escape. But then, as I walked deeper into the woods, I started to feel something. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sense that I wasn't entirely alone. I shook it off. It was just the isolation getting to me, I thought. The stillness of the forest, the quiet, the way everything seemed to hold its breath. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, creeping under my skin. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the cabin. But as I turned around to head back, something caught my eye. A shadow, flickering just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It wasn't much, just a glimpse, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. I stared at the spot where I'd seen the shadow, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there, just trees and darkness. I started to walk again, my steps faster now. But then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, not mine, crunching through the leaves behind me. I stopped again, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped as well. For a moment, there was nothing, absolute silence. I turned, shining my flashlight in every direction. The beam bounced off tree trunks, the underbrush, but there was no one there. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked back to the cabin quickly, practically running, and slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, my breath coming in short bursts. For the rest of the night, I stayed inside. I didn't sleep much. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked and groaned. But every sound seemed amplified. Every movement in the dark seemed ominous. The next morning, I woke up with the sun, feeling exhausted. I told myself that everything from the night before was just my imagination. There was nothing out there, nothing to be afraid of. I spent the day in the cabin, reading, cooking, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something strange. There were footprints outside the window, fresh ones. They led right up to the cabin door. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just an animal or someone passing by. But then I remembered no one else was supposed to be out here. The cabin was far off the main road. I hadn't seen another car in hours. The footprints were large, far too big to be from an animal. And they weren't just random. They were deliberate, leading directly to the door, then disappearing back into the woods. My heart skipped a beat. I felt a surge of panic, but I tried to calm myself down. It was probably just someone from the nearby property, I thought. Maybe a hunter or a hiker. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to leave the cabin for the rest of the day. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my keys and locked up, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. I took a drive, hoping that the winding roads and the long stretches of empty forest would calm my nerves. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I came back to the cabin in the late afternoon, feeling drained. I knew I was just being paranoid, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave me. I didn't even bother to check the footprints again. That night, I locked every window and door before going to bed. But even then, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind outside seemed to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a restless night. I kept waking up, looking out the window, and listening to the sounds of the night. I finally fell into a fitful sleep just before dawn. When I woke up, it was already light outside. I felt exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things quickly, didn't bother with breakfast, and locked the cabin behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin. standing alone in the forest. It looked so peaceful, so still, but I knew I wouldn't be coming back. Something about it just didn't feel right. I've never told anyone about that weekend. Not the footprints, not the strange feeling of being watched. And I'm not sure why. Maybe I don't want to sound crazy. Maybe I don't want to relive it. But every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, or when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear those footsteps behind me, and I wonder if I was really alone that weekend after all. But I do know one thing for sure. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. It was late October, the kind of autumn day where the air was crisp, and the trees in the mountains were starting to shed their leaves. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My friend Mark and I had decided to get away from the chaos of city life, leave behind the endless noise of traffic and the never-ending glow of streetlights. We were heading to a remote cabin in the mountains of Vermont, far from any distractions. I remember the drive up the winding roads, the trees thick with orange and yellow leaves, the hills growing steeper with each mile. Mark had rented the cabin online after doing some research, claiming it was the perfect spot for a weekend of peace and quiet. Neither of us had ever been to this part of Vermont, but it sounded like the ideal place to disconnect. It was supposed to be cozy, secluded, and perfect for a few days of hiking and catching up. We arrived as the sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. A small, wooden building with a wide front porch, a stone chimney, and a single large window that overlooked the valley below. There was a fire pit in front of the cabin and a small path leading into the woods. We unloaded our gear and set up inside. The cabin had a rustic charm to it: old wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a few mismatched furniture pieces that somehow fit perfectly. The air smelled of wood and earth, the kind of scent you get when you're deep in the forest. The windows were large, offering a stunning view of the mountain range. It felt peaceful, like we were the only ones left in the world. That evening, we spent time by the fire, the crackling sound of the burning with the only noise around us. We ate some food we had packed and cracked open a couple of beers. The cold mountain air was sharp, but it felt good to be out here, away from the chaos of everyday life. By the time we decided to turn in, the sky had turned dark, the only light coming from the glow of the fire. The cabin felt warm, and the bed I was sleeping in was surprisingly comfortable. Mark had taken the room next door, and we both quickly fell asleep, lulled by the sound of the wind howling through the trees outside. It was the kind of weekend I had been craving for months. A break from the city, from the noise, the chaos, and the never-ending cycle of work. I had taken the time off, packed up my gear, and drove out to a remote cabin in the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small old cabin tucked away somewhere in the Adirondack Mountains. The kind of place you could lose yourself for a few days and forget about everything else. A friend had recommended it to me, claiming it was perfect for getting away from it all. I'm someone who loves solitude, and when I arrived, I was immediately struck by the quiet. No city sounds, no distractions, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds. The cabin itself was a modest, weathered wooden structure with a small porch and a few windows that overlooked a clearing. It had an old-world charm to it, though the wood seemed dark with age, and the door creaked ominously when I opened it. I settled in, unpacking my things, putting on a pot of coffee, and then stepping out onto the porch to survey my surroundings. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the forest, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It was exactly what I needed. But then, as I stood there, taking it all in, I noticed something strange, something out of place. There was movement, just a flicker at the edge of the woods. It was too far for me to make out clearly, but I saw something or someone shifting through the trees. My first thought was that it was probably a deer or some other animal, but then the movement stopped, and the trees around that spot seemed to rustle unnaturally. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt very exposed, standing there on the porch. I tried to shake it off. I had always been a bit jumpy in unfamiliar places, but as the night drew on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I didn't want to let my mind run wild with ideas. I had come here to relax, not to let my imagination get the best of me. But I kept checking the woods, looking out over the clearing, as if expecting someone to step out from between the trees. It was well past dark by the time I finally decided to go inside. I locked the door behind me, though I had no idea why. It was just a habit. The cabin seemed peaceful enough, yet my unease was growing. I made myself some dinner, a simple stew I had brought with me, and tried to focus on relaxing, maybe reading a book or listening to music. Anything to distract me, but the silence outside the cabin seemed deafening. Every now and then, I would hear a snap of a twig or the distant rustle of leaves. Small things, but enough to keep me on edge. Every time I went to the window to check, I saw nothing. Still, the sense of being watched lingered. I tried to ignore it, but sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay awake in the bed, listening to the sounds of the night. The creak of the old wood, the occasional howling of a distant coyote, and the occasional snap of something in the woods. I kept thinking I heard footsteps just outside the cabin, but whenever I'd jump out of bed and peek out the window, there was nothing. By the time the morning light crept through the trees, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, and I needed to get outside, get moving, and maybe even take a walk to clear my head. So, after making a quick breakfast, I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. The forest was still quiet, almost too quiet. The sun was just beginning to filter through the canopy of trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. I decided to explore the area around the cabin, making my way through the dense woods. The ground was soft beneath my boots, with leaves and branches littering the path. It was a beautiful, peaceful walk, but my mind kept returning to the unsettling feeling I had experienced the night before. I came across a small stream that ran through the forest. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth rocks. I knelt down to take a drink, feeling the coolness of the water as it ran over my hands. I stood there for a while, listening to the sound of the stream, trying to ground myself in the present moment. That's when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There were footprints, large, heavy prints, leading away from the stream, deeper into the woods. They were too big to be from a deer or any other animal I could think of. They looked like human footprints, but they weren't mine. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up once again. The tracks were fresh, too, only a few hours old, if that. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the footprints, trying to stay quiet, to make as little noise as possible. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees growing thicker, the air heavier. It felt as though I was walking deeper into a place I shouldn't be. But I had to know who or what had left these prints. The tracks led me to a small clearing, one I hadn't noticed before. The ground was softer here, the grass lush and green, and in the middle of the clearing, there was something that made my stomach drop. A pile of broken branches and twigs, as if someone had hastily built a shelter or a blind. I froze. The air felt thick with tension. For a moment, I thought I heard something. A crackling of leaves, the rustle of clothing, the unmistakable sound of someone moving quietly through the woods. I spun around, but there was no one there. The clearing was empty. My mind raced. Could it have been another camper? Maybe someone else who had set up in the woods? But the tracks didn't seem like they belonged to a hiker. They were too heavy, too deliberate. I stepped back slowly, my instincts telling me to leave, to get back to the cabin and lock myself inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flash of movement at the edge of the trees. I looked up quickly, but again, there was nothing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I turned on my heel and headed back toward the cabin, my pace quickening. Every snap of a twig, every rustling of the leaves seemed to echo in my ears, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt alive, as if something was moving just out of sight, trailing me. By the time I reached the cabin, I was breathless. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it immediately. I leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. My hands were shaking as I tried to steady myself. What had I just experienced? Who was out there? I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I call someone? My mind was racing, but the one thing I knew for sure was that I was no longer alone. Something or someone was in the woods with me. I'd always wanted to get away from the chaos of city life, to be alone, in nature, with nothing but the trees, the mountains, and the silence. So, when the opportunity came up to rent a small cabin in the Appalachian foothills, I jumped on it. I figured it would be the perfect place to unwind, reflect, and enjoy some peace and quiet. Little did I know that the cabin would become a source of unease, and that I would leave with far more than I ever expected. I arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. I was 28 years old, and this trip was supposed to be a solo retreat. I'd packed light, just some clothes, my camera, a few books, and some food. It was my chance to disconnect and recharge. The cabin was located off a narrow dirt road, about 20 miles from the nearest town. Perfect getaway, I thought. The place itself wasn't much to look at, but that was what I liked about it. It was small and modest, with a slanted roof and weathered wood that had probably been there for decades. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it, but the door opened easily. Inside, the space was simple: a small living room, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a loft that served as the bedroom. It smelled of wood and dust, with a hint of something old but comforting. The windows were large, offering a view of the surrounding woods. The whole atmosphere was exactly what I needed: a retreat from everything. The first day was perfect. I spent the afternoon hiking along a nearby trail, taking pictures of the autumn leaves and the distant mountains. By evening, I had a fire going in the wood stove and sat in front of it, reading a book by the glow of the flames. There was something incredibly soothing about being in the cabin, away from the noise of the outside world. I felt content, relaxed, and alone in a way that felt liberating. As the sun set, I went outside to take one last look at the stars. The night sky was pitch black, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, but there was a slight chill in the air that made me shiver. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, then settled in for the night. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up, but it didn't bother me. I had come here for the solitude, and I was embracing it. But by the second night, things started to feel off. First, it was small things. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling like something was watching me. I looked around the room, but there was nothing. The door was still locked, and the windows were shut. I dismissed it as just my imagination. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't anything unusual. The next day, I decided to stay inside and work on my photography portfolio. I didn't want to go hiking again, not yet. There was a certain unease that lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in the woods. Every time I went outside, I felt as though someone or something was watching me from the trees. I chalked it up to the isolation, the strange feeling you get when you're alone in a place far removed from civilization. Later that afternoon, while I was sitting by the window, I noticed something odd. A small pile of rocks had been stacked near the base of a tree just outside the cabin. It was a simple arrangement, but it didn't belong there. I hadn't seen it when I arrived, and I was certain I would have noticed it when I went outside earlier. I told myself it was nothing, just the work of some curious animal or perhaps other hikers who had passed by. But then I saw something else. The cabin's back door, which I had locked when I came inside that morning, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I had been careful to check all the locks when I entered. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Was someone here? Did I leave it open by mistake? I got up and went to the back door, my pulse quickening with each step. When I reached it, I pulled it open fully. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no one in sight. Still, my instincts told me something wasn't right. I closed the door and locked it again, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night, The strange sense of being watched only intensified. I kept hearing noises outside, twigs snapping, footsteps in the distance. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just animals moving around in the woods. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just animals. There was something else. By the third day, I was starting to question my decision to stay. The peaceful retreat I had envisioned had turned into a nightmare of paranoia and unease. I tried to keep myself busy, taking pictures of the landscape and reading, but nothing could shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat by the fire that evening, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock at the door. It was faint, but unmistakable. My heart stopped. Who would be out here? I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. I waited, holding my breath, my hand frozen on the arm of the chair. There was nothing. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, just silence. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, every small noise making me jump. I kept thinking I heard something outside, but when I looked, there was nothing. The wind, the rustling leaves, and the occasional animal were the only things I could see. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to risk being here any longer. I packed my things quickly, feeling a sense of urgency. As I grabbed my bag and made my way out the door, I noticed the pile of rocks again. This time, it was different. The rocks had been rearranged. The simple stack was now an intricate design, something far too deliberate to be the work of animals. Panic surged through me. I threw my bag into the car, my hands shaking. I didn't care about my things or the cabin anymore. I just wanted to get out. As I started the car and pulled down the dirt road, I glanced back one last time at the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I finally found a small cafe, I went inside and asked about the cabin. The owner, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, gave me a strange look. "You were up at that cabin, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded. "You're lucky you left when you did," he said, his voice low. "There's been talk around here. Strange things happen up there. People disappear sometimes. No one knows why, but I'd advise you to stay away from that place." I didn't need to hear more. I left the cafe, got in my car, and drove straight home. I've never returned to that cabin, and I don't plan to. The woods may be beautiful, but they also hold secrets I'm better off not knowing. The strange feeling I had during my time there has stayed with me. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened, but one thing is certain. The silence of that cabin was not peace. It was something far more unsettling. It was a chilly Friday morning in late October when I decided to take the trip. The air had that crispness that only autumn can bring, and the fog was still heavy over the mountain paths as I loaded up my truck with camping gear. I had been meaning to get out of the city for a while, just needed a break from everything. You know? Work, people, the noise, it was all too much. So, I rented a small cabin in the Adirondacks, far enough away to feel isolated but still close enough for a quick getaway. The drive took longer than I expected, mostly because of the winding mountain roads. It was one of those paths that made me appreciate the peace of nature, even if the narrowness of the roads and occasional steep drop-offs made me grip the wheel a little too tightly. The landscape was beautiful, though, tall pines surrounding rolling hills of orange, red, and yellow leaves. Everything about it screamed serenity, which is exactly what I needed. The cabin was hidden up a dirt road off the main path. I had a rough idea of where it was, but as I turned off the road and followed the dirt trail, I began doubting myself. I passed several other smaller, rustic cabins, but none looked like the one I was looking for. Eventually, I spotted a faded wooden sign that said, "Bear Creek Cabin, 2 miles." That was it. I took a deep breath and pressed on, the gravel crunching under the tires as I continued down the path. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly what I expected. Simple, a little run down, but cozy. It had a wooden porch with rocking chairs, and the front door creaked as I stepped inside. The place had been cleaned, though, and everything was arranged neatly. A firewood pile was stacked neatly by the door, and the smell of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air. It was the perfect retreat, the kind of place where I could shut everything out and just be alone with my thoughts for a couple of days. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bags and arranging my gear. The stove was wood-burning, and it wasn't long before I had a fire going, warming up the cabin's interior. I threw some extra logs on and made myself a cup of coffee while I stood by the window, looking out over the surrounding forest. It was quiet, too quiet almost. There was no traffic, no other people, just the occasional bird call. I found it peaceful at first, but as the minutes passed, I realized how strange it felt to be this isolated. That night, after cooking a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, I sat outside on the porch with a beer in hand, watching the stars. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and I wrapped a thick woolen blanket around my shoulders. The fire pit I had built earlier still crackled away, sending occasional sparks into the cold night air. But as the night wore on, the quiet began to feel heavier. It wasn't the usual peaceful stillness of a secluded place. It was more like an absence of sound, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me. Around midnight, I went inside to get some rest. The cabin had one bedroom with a big, comfortable bed. I lay there for a while, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, small, muffled sounds that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe animals moving outside. But the more I listened, the more I realized these sounds were different. They were deliberate, like something was walking around outside, just beyond my view. I tried to convince myself that it was just a deer or a raccoon, but the noise grew louder, closer. The steps seemed to circle the cabin, first on one side, then the other, always just outside of my line of sight. My mind raced as I lay in the dark, straining to listen. The silence between each step stretched out longer than it should have, making the whole thing feel unnatural. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the bed and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. I shone the light across the porch and the area surrounding the cabin. Nothing. The woods were empty. The only thing moving was the wind, blowing leaves and branches. Relieved, I put the flashlight down, but the unease didn't go away. I sat back on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. The feeling that I wasn't alone in that cabin wouldn't leave me. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The next morning, I decided to get some fresh air and take a walk through the woods. I grabbed my boots and a jacket and set off down a trail that I had spotted the day before. The forest was dense here, with thick underbrush and a variety of trees, but the path was well trodden. The sun filtered down through the trees in soft beams, casting long shadows on the ground. The whole place felt calm and peaceful, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more unsettled I felt. It wasn't anything I could see. It was more of an instinct. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap behind me, or the rustle of leaves as if something were following me. But each time I turned, nothing was there. I tried to push the feeling out of my mind. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. After a few hours of walking, I found a small clearing. In the center of it was an old stone well, overgrown with vines and moss. The sight of it unsettled me more than it should have. I stood there for a while, staring at the well, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I didn't want to be there anymore. I turned and hurried back down the trail, trying to shake off the strange feeling. The cabin was still miles away, and the trail felt longer on the return. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were sore, and my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the well. Why had it unsettled me so much? Was I just imagining things? That evening, after dinner, I decided to sit by the fire outside again. I tried to relax, telling myself I was overthinking everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I heard the footsteps again that night, only this time they were unmistakable. There was no mistaking the sound of someone walking around the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, like they were waiting for me to make a move. My heart raced in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't go outside this time. I sat still, listening. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I was terrified. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing moved. The night was dead silent again, except for the crackle of the fire. It took me a while, but I finally mustered the courage to open the door. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, and I stepped out cautiously. The porch was empty. There was no sign of anyone, just the usual shadows and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But that's when I saw it. The wooden sign by the front door had been turned around. It had been facing outward when I first arrived, but now it was facing the cabin, as if someone had deliberately moved it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was no longer alone out here, and I knew it. I packed up the next morning, despite the beautiful view, despite everything I had planned to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't meant to be there. I didn't know who or what had been messing with me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The cabin, the woods, all of it seemed to vanish into the fog, as though it had never been there at all. But as I passed the first bend in the road, I saw something I'll never forget. Standing at the edge of the woods, watching me, was a figure. I slammed my foot on the gas and never looked back. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would want to escape into the woods for solitude. I used to think those people were just running away from life, but after a particularly rough year, I found myself yearning for peace and quiet. The constant noise of city life, the pressure of work, and the weight of constant notifications had finally broken me down. So I decided to rent a cabin, a little place tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The thought of being completely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt, and the occasional chirping of birds, seemed like the perfect reset. I found the cabin online. The description said it was in a secluded spot in the mountains, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The pictures looked peaceful enough. A small wooden structure, maybe a little old, but cozy, perfect. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. There were no sounds of cars, no distant hum of city life, just silence. It was almost unsettling, but I tried to push that feeling aside. After all, I had chosen this place because I wanted to escape from everything. The cabin itself was exactly like the pictures. It had a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs, a simple front door with peeling red paint, and a few windows that looked out into the woods. Inside, it smelled like wood and something faintly musty. The floors creaked as I walked around, and the fireplace was the focal point of the living room. I threw my bags down, made a quick meal in the small kitchen, and decided to head out for a walk. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow over the trees. I didn't expect much from the area surrounding the cabin, just some trees and maybe a few trails. But as I ventured further into the woods, I started to realize something. There were no other trails, no signs of human activity. The deeper I went, the more I felt the isolation. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt suffocating. Every step I took felt like it was taking me further away from the world I knew. By the time I turned back toward the cabin, the sun was almost gone. The woods were dark now, and the sounds of birds and insects had faded, leaving only the rustling of leaves in the wind. I quickened my pace, almost as if I could outrun the unsettling feeling that had crept up on me. I made it back to the cabin just as night fell. The fireplace was already lit, and I felt some comfort in its warmth, though the crackling of the fire only added to the eerie silence outside. I spent the rest of the evening reading a book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the loneliness playing tricks on my mind. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every creak of the floorboards made me tense. Every rustle outside made my heart race. I kept thinking I heard something, maybe someone walking around outside. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing. just the darkness of the woods. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I tried to push the unease aside. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I had come here to relax after all. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the treetops. It was beautiful, peaceful even. But then I noticed something odd. The ground in front of the cabin was disturbed. Not by much, but enough to catch my attention. A few patches of dirt had been scraped away, as though someone had dragged something heavy across it. I couldn't remember seeing that last night, but the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest grew stronger. My mind raced with possibilities, but I forced myself to ignore them. It was probably just animals, I told myself. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. The further I went, the more I realized how disorienting the forest was. The trees seemed to shift around me, and I began to lose track of time. The woods didn't have a pattern, no clear path, no sense of direction. It felt like I was walking in circles, even though I knew I wasn't. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting once again. The same feeling of isolation hung in the air, but now there was something else. A sense of being watched, like eyes were boring into my back from the trees. I didn't even want to go inside, but the thought of being out in the dark woods alone was far worse. That night, I locked the door and kept the curtains closed. I turned on all the lights inside, as if that would make me feel safer. But the silence outside only seemed to grow louder. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps around the cabin, slow, deliberate, as if someone was circling the place. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the perimeter, but there was nothing. The woods were dark and empty. I went back inside, my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just waiting. I tried to sleep, but the sound of my own heartbeat was louder than the silence. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving in the trees. The next day, I decided to leave. I couldn't handle the tension anymore. I packed up my things, ready to get out of there. But as I stepped outside, I froze. The entire area around the cabin was different. The ground had been disturbed more than before. The dirt near the porch had been dug up, and I could see footprints in the soft earth. Large, heavy prints that seemed to circle the cabin. That's when I realized what had been bothering me all along. The place wasn't just isolated, it was intentionally isolated. Someone had been here before me. Someone had been watching me. I didn't even bother to lock the door. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and sped down the narrow dirt road, not once looking back. The drive was long, and my mind raced with thoughts of what I had just experienced. But the further I drove, the more I realized something. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town and stopped at a gas station that I found out the truth. I asked the clerk if there had ever been any incidents around the area, and she gave me a strange look. "You didn't know?" she said. "That cabin, it's been empty for years. The last people who stayed there, well, they never came back. People say there's something wrong with the place. Some say it's cursed, but I don't know about all that. Just don't go back there." I didn't need her to tell me. I knew that cabin was no place for anyone. Not anymore. It was meant to be forgotten, left alone in the woods. I never went back. The woods took something from me that weekend. Something I can't explain, but I know it's there. It's always in the back of my mind now. The feeling that there's something out there, watching, waiting for the next person to wander too far into the woods. And I never will.